22 hours and 30 minutes. That's how long you stay in a concrete box. Every single day. For years. Sometimes decades. According to testimony from former inmates, some men haven't felt sunlight on their skin in over 20 years. They call it the SHU. Officials call it the Security Housing Unit. Prisoners call it something else. A living tomb. This is the story of America's most extreme experiment in isolation. A place where California sends the men it fears most. Gang leaders. Prison killers. Those deemed too dangerous for any other facility. But here's what most people don't know. According to legal filings and multiple investigations, hundreds of men sent here never committed violent crimes. Some were validated as gang members based on nothing more than a birthday card or a drawing. By the end of this documentary, you'll discover why federal judges called conditions here cruel and unusual. Why inmates launched the largest hunger strike in California history. And the hidden truth about what really happens to the human mind when you lock it away from the world. But first, you need to understand what it takes to be sent to the SHU. Because once you're in, getting out is nearly impossible. Pelican Bay State Prison sits in the far northwest corner of California, closer to the Oregon border than to any major city. When it opened in December 1989, it was designed to be California's answer to a problem. What do you do with prisoners that other prisons can't control? The entire complex holds over 3,000 inmates. But inside Pelican Bay, there's a prison within the prison. The Security Housing Unit. The SHU. The SHU. According to prison documents, each SHU cell measures exactly 7 feet 10 inches by 11 feet 6 inches. Approximately 80 square feet. Smaller than a parking space. This is where California's most dangerous inmates live. For years. Sometimes for the rest of their lives. Former Pelican Bay psychiatrist Dr. Terry Kupers testified in federal court about what he found. He described prisoners pacing like caged animals. Men talking to themselves. Inmates smearing feces on walls. Complete psychological deterioration. Pelican Bay is California's only supermax facility. That classification means something specific. According to the National Institute of Corrections, supermax prisons are designed for the most dangerous, violent, and disruptive inmates. Complete isolation. Minimal human contact. Total control. But here's where it gets complicated. Multiple investigations, including a landmark 1995 federal case, found something disturbing. Court records show that many inmates sent to the SHU weren't there because of violent behavior in prison. They were there because of alleged gang affiliation. The validation process works like this. Prison officials gather evidence that an inmate is affiliated with a prison gang. According to legal testimony, that evidence could be letters, drawings, photographs, even greeting cards. If 3 pieces of evidence are collected within a 6-year period, the inmate is validated as a gang member or associate. Once validated, the sentence is automatic. Indefinite assignment to the SHU. Not for 6 months. Not for 2 years. Indefinite. The only way out? Debrief. Meaning, give up information about gang members and activities. Become an informant. But in the prison gang culture, debriefing is a death sentence. Former inmates describe it simply. You debrief, you're marked for death. So men face an impossible choice. Stay in isolation forever, or put a target on your back. But what most people don't know is how long indefinite actually becomes. We'll come back to that. First, you need to understand the rules that control every second of life inside the SHU. Inside the SHU, 3 rules govern everything. Break them, and you don't just lose privileges. According to disciplinary records, you can add years to your isolation term. So let's be clear about what doing time in the SHU actually means. According to prison operational procedures, a SHU inmate's daily routine is virtually identical every single day. Court testimony describes it like this. Wake up. Usually around 6 a.m. when breakfast is delivered through a slot in your cell door. You eat alone. In your cell. Always in your cell. Former inmates describe what comes next. Nothing. You wait. You have a television if you've purchased one through the prison canteen and if you haven't lost the privilege through disciplinary action. You have whatever books are approved. You have the concrete walls. At some point, according to operational protocol, you get 90 minutes of exercise. But this isn't a gym. Court records describe the SHU exercise yards as individual concrete pens, roughly 16 by 25 feet, surrounded by 20-foot walls. Prisoners describe them as dog runs. You exercise alone. You're surrounded by concrete on all sides. Above you, a metal grate. One inmate testified that he could see a small rectangle of sky through the grate. That was his only view of the outside world for 11 years. Lunch arrives. Through the slot. Dinner arrives. Through the slot. The lights dim at 10 p.m., but according to testimony from multiple inmates, they never go completely dark. You sleep under fluorescent lighting. Every night. For years. The SHU is designed around a principle called administrative segregation. Legal documents define this as separation from the general prison population. But former Pelican Bay warden Joe McGrath described the reality more bluntly in his testimony. These inmates have virtually no human contact. According to operational procedures, SHU inmates don't work. They don't attend classes. They don't go to the library or the cafeteria. They don't participate in group activities. Because there are no group activities. Former inmates describe shouting to communicate with prisoners in other cells. Yelling through the narrow gaps in the doors. The prison calls this disruptive behavior. It can result in disciplinary action. Court testimony reveals the level of isolation. When medical staff visit, they speak to inmates through the food slot. When mental health professionals conduct evaluations, those often happen through the food slot. The rare times an inmate leaves his cell, he's handcuffed. Officers escort him. He returns to his cell. Visits are restricted. According to prison policy, SHU inmates can receive visits, but they're non-contact. You sit in a booth. Your visitor sits on the other side of reinforced glass. You speak through a telephone. You haven't touched another human being in years. And you won't today either. The third rule is simple but absolute. According to disciplinary records and testimony, any rule violation in the SHU results in additional punishment. And that punishment extends your time in isolation. Legal filings document the system. Let's say you're already serving an indefinite SHU term for gang validation. You commit a rule violation. Maybe you refuse to return your food tray. Maybe you cover your cell window. Maybe you're caught with contraband. A rules violation report, or RVR, is filed. Former inmate Todd Ashker testified about this system. He described inmates losing phone privileges for months, losing yard time, being placed in administrative segregation within the SHU, which means even more restricted conditions. Some violations, according to court records, resulted in inmates losing years of progress toward potential SHU release. But here's what makes this system particularly harsh. You're already in indefinite isolation. You already have no release date. So what happens when you have nothing left to lose? When every day is identical to the last. When you've been in the same 80-square-foot cell for a decade. That's when the real danger begins. Not the danger of violence. The danger of something much worse. And that brings us to what the courts actually found when they investigated what life in the SHU does to the human mind. A lawsuit reaches federal court. Madrid versus Gomez. It would become one of the most significant legal cases in American prison history. And it would expose what really happens when you isolate human beings for years at a time. Judge Thelton Henderson presided over the case. He heard testimony from prisoners, from psychiatrists, from prison officials, from human rights experts. And in January 1995, he issued his ruling. The court found that conditions in Pelican Bay's SHU may well hover on the edge of what is humanly tolerable. Judge Henderson wrote that the evidence showed inmates suffering from severe psychological trauma, hallucinations, paranoia, rage, emotional flatness, social withdrawal. Dr. Stuart Grassian, a psychiatrist who testified in the case, described what he observed. According to his expert testimony, prolonged solitary confinement can cause a specific psychiatric syndrome. He documented symptoms across multiple Pelican Bay prisoners: visual and auditory hallucinations, hypersensitivity to external stimuli, panic attacks, cognitive dysfunction, paranoia, impulse control problems, and aggressive fantasies. One prisoner testified that he saw objects moving on their own. Another described hearing voices that weren't there. A third reported feeling insects crawling on his skin when nothing was there. These weren't inmates with pre-existing mental illness. These were documented psychological responses to extreme isolation. But here's the system most people don't know about. According to the court findings, Pelican Bay officials knew about these psychological effects. Mental health staff documented them. But the system had no mechanism to prevent the deterioration. In fact, court testimony showed that inmates with serious mental illness were sometimes held in the SHU despite the obvious harm it was causing. Judge Henderson's ruling was specific. He found that housing mentally ill inmates in the SHU violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The state was ordered to change its practices regarding seriously mentally ill prisoners in the SHU. But the ruling didn't end the SHU. It didn't free the hundreds of inmates serving indefinite terms based on gang validation. And that's where the second hidden system comes in. The validation process itself. According to investigative reporting by The Guardian and other outlets, as well as testimony in multiple legal cases, the evidence used to validate inmates as gang members was often questionable. Court filings show examples: a greeting card with certain symbols, a drawing, a photograph with someone wearing gang colors, enrollment in an Aztec history course. Todd Ashker, the inmate who would later become a lead plaintiff in another major lawsuit, testified about his validation. According to court documents, he was validated based in part on a Christmas card he received and a drawing found in his cell. He maintained he was not a gang member. It didn't matter. He spent over 20 years in the SHU. Legal documents reveal the numbers. By 2011, approximately 1,100 inmates were being held in Pelican Bay's SHU. The majority were there based on gang validation, not on specific violent acts committed in prison. And the average length of stay? Court testimony put it at 6.8 years. But many had been there far longer. Some for over 2 decades. Here's why that matters. The original design of supermax facilities was to house inmates temporarily. Remove the most violent, most disruptive prisoners from the general population for a limited time, then return them when they demonstrated changed behavior. But the gang validation system created something different. Permanent isolation. Indefinite solitary confinement. And the only way out was debriefing, providing information on gang activities and members. But former gang investigators and inmates testified about what that really meant. You had to give names. You had to give specific information. And if the information wasn't valuable enough, you weren't released. Multiple former inmates described the impossible situation. If you debrief, you're labeled a snitch. If you're labeled a snitch and you're ever released back to general population or transferred to another prison, you're a target. Some inmates who debriefed were later assaulted or killed. So you have men who say they're not gang members, validated based on limited evidence, facing indefinite isolation, with the only exit route being one that might get them killed. And the psychological damage is accumulating every single day. But in 2011, something happened that would change everything. The prisoners in Pelican Bay's SHU decided they had nothing left to lose. And what they did next would become the largest prison protest in California history. To understand what the SHU really does to a person, you need to hear from the men who lived it. These are documented cases. Real people. Real testimony. Starting with a man who would help organize a protest that would shake California's entire prison system. Todd Ashker entered Pelican Bay's SHU in 1990. According to his legal filings and testimony, he was validated as a member of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. Ashker maintained he was not a member. The evidence against him, documented in court records, included a drawing, correspondence, and photographs. In the SHU, Ashker became a jailhouse lawyer. He studied law. He filed grievances. And according to multiple legal documents and news accounts, he began organizing. Not organizing violence. Organizing resistance through the legal system and nonviolent protest. By 2011, Ashker had been in isolation for over 20 years. He described his experience in sworn testimony. He testified about the sensory deprivation, the loss of social skills, the difficulty even speaking to another human being after years of minimal contact. He described watching men deteriorate mentally, inmates who paced constantly, men who screamed at night, prisoners who cut themselves or attempted suicide. But what Ashker did next had never been done before in California's prison system. He reached out to rival gang leaders in the SHU, Norteños, Serenos, Black Guerrilla Family, Aryan Brotherhood, groups that had been enemies for decades. And he proposed something radical, a unified hunger strike to protest indefinite solitary confinement. July 1, 2011. According to California Department of Corrections records, 6,600 inmates across the California prison system refused meals. It started in Pelican Bay's SHU and spread to prisons statewide. The demands, documented in a written statement from prisoner representatives, were specific. 1. End group punishment and administrative abuse. 2. Abolish the debriefing policy and modify gang validation criteria. 3. Comply with the U.S. Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons recommendations regarding long-term solitary confinement. 4. Provide adequate food. 5. Expand and provide constructive programming. According to news reports from the time, prison officials initially downplayed the strike. But as it continued into its second week, medical concerns grew. Inmates were losing significant amounts of weight. Some required hospitalization. After 3 weeks, the strike ended. The California Department of Corrections agreed to review some policies. But according to prisoner advocates and legal observers, no substantial changes were implemented. So in September 2011, just 2 months later, another hunger strike began. This one lasted even longer. These men had nothing. No freedom. No human contact. But they found one way to be heard. While Ashker organized, other men suffered in silence. Danny Troxell was sent to Pelican Bay's SHU in 1987, even before the prison officially opened. He spent over 25 years in continuous solitary confinement. Troxell described what that time did to him. According to his sworn statement, he experienced paranoia, hypersensitivity to noise, social anxiety, and difficulty maintaining conversations. He testified that after so many years without physical contact, he felt uncomfortable even shaking hands. But Troxell's testimony revealed something else. The arbitrary nature of the system. He described being validated based on his associations, his correspondence, his reading materials. Court documents show he was never accused of committing a violent act while in the SHU. Yet he remained there year after year, because the validation wouldn't be removed unless he debriefed. In legal filings, Troxell testified about losing touch with reality. He described having to consciously remind himself what day it was, what month it was. He testified that time lost all meaning. Every day was identical. There were no seasons in the SHU. No weather. Just the same concrete cell. The same fluorescent lights. The same food through the same slot in the same door. Ronald Yandel's case reveals another layer of the system. According to court records, Yandel was on death row at San Quentin when he was transferred to Pelican Bay's SHU. He was validated as an Aryan Brotherhood member. Court testimony shows he spent years in SHU conditions while also facing capital punishment. Yandel testified about the unique hell of his situation. He described being isolated from the already isolated death row population. In sworn statements, he recounted the complete sensory deprivation, the loss of mental acuity, the difficulty reading or concentrating after years in the SHU. But Yandel's testimony highlighted something the courts would later focus on. According to his statements and those of other death row inmates in the SHU, they weren't being held in isolation because of misconduct in prison. They were there because of alleged gang affiliation. And because California's death penalty cases move so slowly through appeals, some death row inmates were spending 10, 15, even 20 years in SHU conditions before their cases were resolved. Multiple medical experts testified about what they observed in these long-term SHU prisoners. Dr. Terry Kupers, the psychiatrist mentioned earlier, examined inmates who'd been in the SHU for over a decade. He testified about severe psychological symptoms, cognitive decline, memory problems, inability to tolerate social interaction. George Ruiz was 21 years old when he was sent to Pelican Bay's SHU. According to legal documents, he was validated as a gang member based on his associations and correspondence. He would spend his entire 20s and part of his 30s in isolation. Ruiz testified about entering the SHU as a young man and emerging years later, with no idea how to interact with others. According to his sworn statement, he described panic attacks when guards approached his cell, extreme anxiety during the rare times he was around other people, a complete loss of social development during years when most people are learning to navigate adult relationships. But Ruiz's case raised another troubling question documented in court records. How do you rehabilitate someone through total isolation? California's correctional system, according to official mission statements, is supposed to prepare inmates for eventual release. Yet testimony showed that long-term SHU inmates were developing severe disabilities that made them less prepared for society, not more. Former Warden Robert Ayers testified in federal court about this contradiction. According to his testimony, he acknowledged that the SHU did not provide rehabilitative programming. It was purely punitive and management-focused. Inmates in the SHU couldn't take classes, couldn't work, couldn't participate in therapy or counseling groups, because the SHU had none of those things. July 8, 2013, the third and largest hunger strike began. According to California Department of Corrections data, 30,000 inmates across the state participated at its peak. It would last 60 days and become the longest prison hunger strike in American history. This time, the strike drew national attention. Human rights organizations issued statements. Medical professionals expressed alarm. Legislators called for investigations. According to news reports from the time, some inmates lost 30, 40, even 50 pounds. Several were hospitalized. Todd Ashker, Danny Troxell, Ronald Yandel, and George Ruiz were named as lead representatives. According to legal documents, they endured some of the harshest conditions during the strike. Prison officials testified that these inmates were closely monitored. Some were placed in stripped cells. Some lost privileges for organizing the protest. But the strike achieved something. It forced attention on a system that had operated largely in secret for 2 decades. Legislators toured Pelican Bay. Journalists investigated. Academics studied the psychological research. And attorneys prepared for another legal battle. In May 2012, before the 2013 hunger strike, a federal lawsuit was filed. Ashker versus Governor of California. The plaintiffs were Todd Ashker and other long-term SHU prisoners. The defendant was the entire California correctional system. And the claim was simple: indefinite solitary confinement based on gang validation violates the Constitution. The case didn't go to trial for 3 years. During that time, according to court filings, attorneys took depositions. Experts examined inmates. Medical professionals documented psychological harm. Prison officials defended their policies. And thousands of men remained in the SHU, waiting. September 2015. After years of litigation and mediation, a settlement was reached. According to the settlement terms, California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation. The state would implement a new system for assigning inmates to the SHU, one based on specific behavior rather than alleged affiliation. Under the settlement, documented in legal filings, inmates who had been in the SHU for 10 or more years based primarily on gang validation would be eligible for review and transfer to general population. The state agreed to provide a step-down program, a series of housing units where inmates could gradually reintegrate with more privileges and social contact. According to data from the California Department of Corrections and legal observers monitoring the settlement, hundreds of long-term SHU inmates were eventually transferred out of isolation. Some, like Todd Ashker, were moved to general population after spending over 20 years in the SHU. But the story doesn't end with victory, because the settlement raised new questions. Questions about what happens when you release someone who's been completely isolated for 2 decades. Can they adapt? Can they function in a social environment? And most importantly, what permanent damage has been done? Here's what most people don't know about the Pelican Bay settlement. The twist that rarely makes the headlines. According to follow-up reporting by criminal justice journalists and testimony from social workers and psychologists who work with these inmates, many of the men released from long-term SHU isolation are struggling severely. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychology professor at UC Santa Cruz who has studied the effects of solitary confinement for decades, testified about what he calls post-SHU syndrome. According to his research and expert testimony, inmates released from long-term isolation show symptoms similar to PTSD, but with additional complications. Haney documented specific impairments. Social anxiety so severe that inmates can't tolerate being in a room with more than a few people. Hypervigilance and paranoia that makes normal interaction impossible. Difficulty with decision-making after years of having every decision made for them. And perhaps most tragically, the inability to form or maintain relationships. According to interviews with former SHU inmates conducted by journalists and researchers, some men describe feeling more comfortable in isolation than in general population. After 15, 20, 25 years in the SHU, the cell became home. Social interaction became terrifying. The noise and unpredictability of general population became overwhelming. Legal observers and prisoner advocates documented something shocking. Some inmates released from the SHU under the settlement actually requested to return to isolation. Not because they preferred it, but because they could no longer function anywhere else. The SHU had become their entire reality. But here's the deeper truth. According to California Department of Corrections data, many SHU inmates will eventually be released from prison entirely. They'll serve their sentences and return to society. And when they do, they'll bring the psychological damage with them. Reentry specialists and social workers who testified in various legal proceedings described the challenge. How do you help someone reintegrate into society when they can't tolerate being around other people? When they panic in crowds? When they have no social skills and severe mental health issues from years of isolation? According to research cited in court testimony, long-term solitary confinement doesn't make communities safer. It creates damaged individuals with severe psychological problems, then releases them into those communities. The recidivism rates, documented in multiple studies, are high. Not because the individuals are inherently dangerous, but because they're psychologically unable to navigate the outside world. Dr. Stuart Grassian, the psychiatrist who studied Pelican Bay prisoners, put it bluntly in his testimony. He stated that prolonged solitary confinement can cause irreversible harm, that after a certain point, the psychological damage cannot be undone, and that California, by holding inmates in the SHU for decades, was creating permanent disabilities. So what's happened since the 2015 settlement? According to California Department of Corrections data and reporting by criminal justice journalists, the SHU population at Pelican Bay has decreased. Not eliminated, but reduced. As of recent reporting, approximately 400 to 500 inmates remain in SHU housing, compared to over 1,000 before the settlement. The validation system has changed. According to policy documents, inmates can no longer be held in the SHU indefinitely based on gang status alone. They must commit specific rule violations. The debriefing requirement has been modified. The step-down program has been implemented. But legal advocates and former inmates describe ongoing problems. According to testimony in monitoring hearings and reports from legal observers, the step-down program has faced implementation issues. Some inmates wait months or years for transfer. The programming that's supposed to help them reintegrate is limited. And the psychological damage from years already spent in isolation remains. Todd Ashker, now in general population after over 20 years in the SHU, has given interviews describing his experience. He talks about the difficulty of being around other people, the challenge of making simple decisions, the ongoing psychological effects that he believes will stay with him for the rest of his life. But here's the truth that extends beyond Pelican Bay. Beyond California. According to data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and human rights organizations, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 inmates are held in some form of solitary confinement across the United States on any given day. Pelican Bay's SHU isn't unique. It's just the most documented. According to legal challenges and investigations in multiple states, similar conditions exist in supermax facilities across the country. ADX Florence in Colorado, Ohio State Penitentiary, Red Onion in Virginia. The list goes on. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has weighed in. According to UN reports, prolonged solitary confinement, defined as more than 15 consecutive days, constitutes torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The UN has specifically called on the United States to end the practice. But according to data from correctional departments across the country, thousands of inmates remain in solitary confinement for months, years, even decades. The practice continues. And the debate continues about whether there's ever a justification for it. The Pelican Bay settlement didn't answer all the questions. It didn't resolve the fundamental tension at the heart of the American correctional system. How do you manage the most dangerous, most violent inmates without destroying them psychologically? How do you protect other prisoners and staff without resorting to torture? Is there a middle ground between complete isolation and unacceptable risk? According to correctional experts who've testified in various legal proceedings, alternatives exist. Some European countries, documented in comparative studies, manage dangerous inmates with much less isolation. High-security units with small group interactions. Mental health treatment instead of punishment. Rehabilitation programming even for the most serious offenders. But implementing those alternatives requires money, resources, political will. And according to political observers and criminal justice advocates, those are in short supply when it comes to prison reform. So the SHU remains. Modified, reduced in population, but still operating. Still housing men in near total isolation. Still, according to mental health professionals who work there, causing psychological damage. And across America, tens of thousands of other inmates remain in similar conditions. But here's the final truth. The revelation that ties all of this together. According to research by criminologists and data from multiple correctional departments, the vast majority of inmates in solitary confinement will eventually be released. Not to general population. To society. To your communities. Bureau of Justice statistics show that over 95% of all inmates will eventually leave prison. That includes many who spent years in solitary confinement. And when they're released, according to reentry programs and social services, they often come out worse than when they went in. More damaged. More unstable. Less capable of functioning in society. The question isn't just about what we do to people in prison. It's about what kind of people we're creating and then releasing back into the world. Dr. Craig Haney testified that long-term solitary confinement doesn't serve any correctional purpose. It doesn't rehabilitate. It doesn't improve behavior long-term. According to his expert opinion, it simply damages people and calls it justice. The Pelican Bay hunger strikes. The lawsuits. The settlements. They changed policies. They helped hundreds of individual prisoners. But according to legal advocates and formerly incarcerated people who speak on this issue, they didn't solve the fundamental problem. America still uses isolation as punishment. And isolation, according to decades of psychological research, is one of the most harmful things you can do to a human being. This is the reality most people never see. Today, Pelican Bay State Prison still operates. The SHU is still there. Men are still held in isolation, though under different policies than before. The concrete cells remain. The food slots remain. The exercise pens remain. According to the most recent data available from California Department of Corrections, reforms continue to be implemented. Monitoring continues. Legal challenges continue. And the debate over solitary confinement continues, not just in California, but across America. Some of the men who spent decades in the SHU are now advocates. They speak at universities. They testify before legislators. They work with organizations trying to end long-term solitary confinement. They're using what happened to them to try to prevent it from happening to others. But according to their testimony and public statements, they all carry the scars. The psychological damage doesn't disappear when you leave the SHU. It stays with you. Some describe it as living with ghosts. The ghost of the person you were before isolation. The ghost of all those years that can never be reclaimed. The SHU. The Security Housing Unit. Pelican Bay's experiment in extreme isolation. It raised questions that America still hasn't answered. Questions about punishment and humanity. About security and cruelty. About what we're willing to do to people in the name of public safety. And perhaps most importantly, it forced us to confront a simple truth. When we isolate someone for years, we don't just punish them. We change them. And not in the ways we intended. But here's what you need to know. What we haven't talked about yet. According to recent investigative reporting and legal monitoring reports, the reforms at Pelican Bay haven't spread as widely as advocates hoped. Other states watched the lawsuits. They saw the settlements. And some, according to legal observers, simply adjusted their policies just enough to avoid similar litigation while maintaining similar isolation practices. The real story of the SHU isn't just about one prison in Northern California. It's about a system. A nationwide reliance on isolation as management. And according to human rights organizations, prison reform advocates, and formerly incarcerated people, that system is still very much in place. So the question isn't whether Pelican Bay's SHU was cruel. Federal judges already answered that. The question is, what are we going to do about all the other SHUs that still exist? The ones that haven't had major lawsuits. The ones that haven't drawn national attention. The ones where men and women are right now, at this moment, sitting in concrete cells, losing their grip on reality. That's the story we need to keep investigating. That's the truth we need to keep exposing. Because according to every expert who's studied this, every person who's lived through it, every judge who's examined it, prolonged solitary confinement breaks people. And we're still doing it. The fight against the SHU continues. The legal battles continue. The human suffering continues. And the questions remain unanswered. If you want to see more investigations into America's prison system, the conditions, the cases, the people the system forgot, check out our documentary on ADX Florence, the federal supermax where the most dangerous criminals in America are held. Because the story of solitary confinement in America is far from over. This has been an investigation into the SHU. Into what happens when we lock human beings away from the world. Into the cost of isolation. A cost we're all paying whether we know it or not.